But comics, I believe very strongly, and I'm committed personally to this, are emerging from a kind of folk literature or cheap literature to a quality literary form. There's certainly a distinct relationship between film and comics. I like to think of comics as a film on paper. I have always maintained that in the beginning, God made comics. Then he made film. Film is an extension of comics. Comics is an attempt to communicate with the visual form. When the Spirit began to revive in the 70s, my astonishment when Phil Suling called me up and asked me to come down to attend a convention, the first convention in New York, and I found that there were people there who were reading the Spirit. I remember Dennis Kitchen came over to me and asked me if he could reprint Spirit stories. I said, "Do you really want to do that?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, who'd be interested? The character's been dead. He's been in a box for the last 20 years. I must confess, it's a very rewarding thing. It's not every cartoonist or artist who can see a character that he created or see something he created survive to another generation. The Spirit was an anti-hero because I never took the whole idea of the superhero seriously. The fact that he wore a mask was a concession I made much against my better judgment, really my instinctive desire to deal with the hero. I was looking for realism in my stories. Actually, the Spirit stories were stories in which the Spirit only played a part of it, rather than the story built around any particular strengths that he might have. For me, the waterfront represented a marvelous opportunity for settings. Many of the stories I did used the waterfront almost as a key to the total story. Generally, the prime action, the denouement of the story occurred on the waterfront for me because here is where the criminals were either caught entering or escaping. And the waterfront represented that throughout the whole. I guess if you would want to summarize the position of the waterfront in all the Spirit stories I ever did, you might say that it was the entrance staging area for most of the adventure stories. My orientation is essentially theater, that is live theater and stage set. My father was, after all, a scenery painter. And my earliest impressions, theatrical impressions at any rate, came from live theater and remained with me throughout. I'm probably more influenced by my memory of theater than I am of film, because film is, after all, not really connected with a closed-in scene. It doesn't have the feel and the smell of a contained dimension. By introducing the weather elements like rain, extreme rain, or fog or snow, I can enhance the element of danger and bring to the reader a greater element of personal contact. It enables me to reach the reader a little bit more easily, emotionally. The city has influenced my lighting, my thinking of lighting and containment tremendously. I always thought of light coming from above. All my experience has been in the city, in narrow streets where your source of light was either a lamppost or a light of the sunshine filtered down through the space between two buildings, or an alley. Strong women were things that I always admired. I was always attracted to women who were competent and skillful and people in themselves. There's so much in a city like New York City, which after all occupies the position of being central city in most of my stories. And in the later work that I've done outside of the Spirit, the portfolio called The Big City, and then ultimately a 132-page book of vignettes of the city called The City. All of these are built around the areas of the city where all kinds of action can take place. Stories emerge from almost any portion of a city you can think of. For example, a city throws off a tremendous amount of debris, garbage, junk, all of it left over from the city. Each of these pieces are a story within themselves. You can't even over-dramatize the fact that you can walk into a portion of the city that's partially abandoned, pick up old beer cans and bits of debris, and find a story right there on the spot. This is the element with which I work, and this makes the fiber of the large part of most of the body of my work. The city for me is really not only the setting, but the source of story material. Generally, I do not use photographic research. I try very hard to work from memory because I'm dealing with a form of impressionism. Very few of us remember things in a clear, highly detailed fashion. And most of our adventure and experiences leave the backgrounds in a form of a blur, which leave for us an impression, and this is what I try to convey. I spent around 25 years in a company that I owned, publishing and utilizing comics or sequential art as a teaching tool. I did an awful lot of those during the period between 1955 and 1970. We did a lot for the school system in the United States, and also for the Department of Defense. I first discovered the use of comics during World War II when I was involved in the training area where they had to train people very rapidly in procedural matters. And I've discovered that I had a tool in my hand that was very, very useful, and it worked beautifully. Poorhouse Press was a publishing company I started shortly after I sold my educational publishing companies. That was an attempt on my part to publish books that nobody would publish. Gleeful Guides was just a series of humorous books I felt I wanted to do sometime, and I did them. Over the last 6 or 7 years, I've produced something like 4 or 5 graphic novels. Graphic novel generally takes me about 1.5 years to do, from writing stage to actual execution. I work fairly fast, but I spend a lot of time in thinking out a story and working out the plot. Contract with God, and particularly Life Force, which I've just completed, as I said, is built on a historical frame. It's an attempt to tell history of life in the city, particularly in the Bronx, in the middle 30s during the Depression, which is a very interesting period of time, not necessarily exciting, but a very interesting period of time for me because I lived through it. As far as the employment of Jewish culture, this stems from the fact that I'm more familiar with Jewish culture than I am with any other culture, and I employ it because it's something I know and I understand.
America looks for answers after the space shuttle explodes in a ball of fire.
Coming up, the experts try to explain this country's worst space disaster.
Life on Another Planet was a political statement. There's no question about it. I had a political statement in mind, and it's very rare that I have been doing anything but social commentary. I've always seemed to me have been in a teaching posture because I ran a studio largely composed of new artists, people who come in from other fields. Back in 1938, when I started Eisner and Eiger, most of the members of that studio were people who come from other fields. They were painters who found a job in comics. They were illustrators who found a job in comics. So I was always teaching, it seemed to me, along with getting production. As far as the whole idea of teaching a new generation, I find it very exciting and very important from a selfish point of view, from a career selfish point of view, because the more people I feel that get interested in this field and approach this field seriously and professionally, the better will be the product. Opportunity came along and someone bought the company out from under me, and I then decided I would continue on as doing my own creative thing. I remember sitting in the kitchen talking to my wife, and she said to me, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I don't know. Maybe I'll find another publishing company and start a new publishing company." She said, "Why don't you do what you always said you were going to do? Here's your chance to either put up or shut up." So I always used to say, one of these days I'm going to get rid of all this business stuff and settle down and write and draw. Well, I did. I bought a house in White Plains and with a studio next door, and began writing and drawing. Now I'm in Florida doing the same thing and enjoying myself.